We've been talking a lot. We'll continue to talk a lot, well, in general. But also, we've been talking a lot specifically about the Green New Deal and about climate change. Our next guest has a couple of stories related to that we thought you would find of interest. He's been on the program several times before. We're always delighted to have him. Gavin Bade is a senior reporter with Utility Dive at utilitydive.com. And first of all, Gavin, welcome back to the program.
RJ, thanks for having me back. I'm always happy to be here.
We're always happy to have you. And secondly, for those who might not know, Utility Dive is, how would you describe it?
I would call it a policy and business media publication for the electric utility industry. So we cover everything from renewable energy to battery storage, electric vehicles, and then on out to the fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, and it's just everything about the energy transition.
Okay, good, because that's what I thought. And the reason why I think it's important to say that is because, you know, we talk a lot on shows like this, if there's any show like this, but on political shows, for want of a better term, we talk a lot about the politicians and the legislative dimension of this kind of in isolation. We talk about the politics of it, or if a program like this, we also talk about activism around the issue. We talk about, you know, new information that comes out, but we tend not to look at something like Green New Deal or climate change legislation from the point of view of, you know, this is a very large and active and complex industry. So in addition to the dimensions that involve, you know, the overall economy or social justice or whatever, the many dimensions of the issue, there is there's this huge infrastructure, this huge industry already in place, and there are debates within that, there are forces within that. So anyway, that's my long-winded way of saying welcome.
Well, thank you. I think that's actually so important that you mentioned that, because while those aspects of environmentalism are so important, right? The politics, the activism, I often also think that sometimes we kind of glaze over the technocratic details that we need to actually make the things that we want to do, actually make them work out in the real world. You know, we want the lights to stay on even as we transition to 100% clean electricity, as many people are talking about, and as we'll talk today. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good. And it's also, by the way, to me personally, interesting, the infrastructure behind energy, the way it's produced, the way it's distributed. It's just as a technically fascinating subject. So you have kind of a cool beat that you cover. And let's just talk about, there were a couple stories I wanted to talk to you about. Let's start with this one because it's timely, all right? The Tennessee Valley Authority, okay. Historic, publicly owned,
yeah,
right?
a federally owned, a federally controlled utility. Although they will tell you, the TVA people will say, you know, we're certainly not, you know, controlled by the federal government directly, right? And I think that we saw that this week. So TVA was actually thinking about closing down 3 generation units, coal-fired generation units that are quite old. 2 of them at the Bull Run plant started operation in the mid-1960s. A unit at their what's called the Paradise Coal plant started operation in 1970. So they released some proposals early this week, saying these are expensive plants. They need maintenance. They're highly inflexible. They can't go up and down. They can't vary their power output very much. And so they said, we have cheaper options. So we're going to close these down. And this precipitated some tweets, first from President Trump saying Tennessee Valley Authority should consider all of its options and very seriously consider all options before they shut down Paradise number 3 coal unit. You know, and he actually not only talked about just TVA, but a specific plant. And then a few minutes later, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, of course he represents Kentucky, said, you know, piled on as well and said, yeah, TVA probably shouldn't shut this down. Today, this morning, the TVA Board of Directors met, and they decided, despite all this pressure from the Trump administration, they were going to shut these plants down. And I think it just speaks to generally the trend we see in the electric utility industry, even as the federal government moves to try to support coal and nuclear plants with various bailout proposals that we've talked about before, and then enhanced research and development for coal plants. It's not changing utility plans. They see the writing on the wall. They see that climate change is a real issue. And more importantly than that, they see that renewable energy and natural gas is just a lot cheaper than these coal plants. That's why they're shutting them down.
Yeah, you know, there are a couple interesting dimensions to that story, Gavin, to me. One is obviously the independence of the TVA, its ability to push back. But the other is, I immediately, of course, there's no way even for an enterprising journalist like yourself to find this out necessarily, but isn't it interesting? You made it, it certainly sounded coordinated the way you described it. And now Donald Trump is not a guy, let's just say he puts in a lot of executive time, according to the recent stories. I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I know Paradise is in Kentucky because of the John Prine song about it. But
right.
one would not necessarily expect, and this I don't have to be disrespectful to the president to say this. One would not necessarily expect the president of the United States to know that Paradise #3 plant is located in Kentucky, much less to have an opinion about whether it should remain open or closed, which is essentially an internal management decision of a federally owned authority. And then a few minutes later, as you point out, Mitch McConnell does it. So I wonder, was there somebody kind of feeding this information?
I mean, a lot of reporters have speculated that, and there's been some reporting from other outlets that has put forward the idea that Bob Murray, the CEO of Murray Energy, the largest privately owned coal mining company in the country, that he was kind of behind this. Murray Energy and Bob Murray, they put in a last-ditch appeal, a last-minute appeal to TVA to keep these plants open because they supply the plants with coal. And people who follow these energy issues will know that Bob Murray is very close to President Trump. Early in the administration, he handed over some what he called coal action plans to President Trump, saying that they should try to bail out the generators that are closing, they should enhance research and development for more efficient coal plants, and just really a laundry list of things that you could do to try to save what is a domestic coal sector that is in decline and has been for years. So the Trump administration has taken a lot of those steps out of that coal action plan. This was not a specific one, but there's been a lot of reporting to suggest that, there may have been some influence from Murray Energy behind this. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the president can appoint board members to the TVA board, and the only member of the board to vote against closing these units was the one board member who was appointed by President Trump. So it could have come from a number of options, but certainly he has allies in and around the Tennessee Valley Authority who could, talk to him or talk to people in his office about it.
So, I don't want to ask you to get too far ahead of your journalistic role, but it seems to me that you have a coal industry that is beginning to struggle, that is struggling in the marketplace, right? It's losing sales, it's losing volume. Probably multiple reasons for that, but one of them may be that, as you point out, in many cases, coal-fired plants are not the cheapest alternative for producing energy. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both from a capital cost perspective, just building the plant, and then also from an operating cost perspective, just what the amount of money it takes to run, especially the older coal plants like these TVA plants, simply more expensive than other sources of energy right now.
So it could be that someone like Bob Murray is looking not to do what might be the conservative ideological thing to do, which is to allow the market to decide what kind of energy production it prefers, but is actually looking for some sort of preferential treatment or protection from market forces from the government.
Very overtly so. And he would, and they have not been shy about saying that they need governmental support to keep these coal plants open. I mean, these were the things that they were asking for from the Trump administration, and they've done it. They've tried to frame it in a few different ways. First, there was a proposal to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that we talked about a year ago, right. And then they were floating around some of these plans for an administrative bailout. We just saw some headlines today about Trump declaring a state of emergency at the border. Well, this time last year, and really all through last year, there was also an open question in the energy sector. Would he declare a state of emergency in electric power generation that would allow him to bail out some of these plants that would be closing? That is still something that could happen. We could wake up tomorrow and that could happen, because this administration is just not very predictable when it comes to those things.
No, and I could see, not that I agree with it, but I could, the writer side of me could craft a statement that would be somewhat plausible sounding. That said, electric power is a necessary piece of keeping our society running. It's in danger. Therefore, I declare a state of blah, blah, blah. So, okay, very, very interesting. Again, we're talking with Gavin Bade, senior reporter for Utility Dive. And Gavin, the other story you wrote recently that I thought was quite interesting, I'm not saying the others aren't now, But nukes can have a small role in Green New Deal, backers say, is the headline. Some people are saying that nuclear power could be part of a Green New Deal, and now we often think of the Green movement as being strongly anti-nuke. So who exactly is saying this?
Well, some of the activists and the lawmakers behind the Green New Deal resolution that rolled out last week have, after a little bit of delay and debate, come to this, this what we could say is a technologically neutral starting point for the Green New Deal debate. So, kind of what happened over the last week is that, last Thursday morning, we had the Green New Deal rollout, and we saw Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Ed Markey, the two kind of people who are leading that charge in each of their respective chambers. They did this big press conference to roll out this Green New Deal resolution. And that resolution very explicitly called for not only renewable electricity, but clean, quote, clean or zero emission electricity. And that would include, at least from the starting point of this debate, because it's only a resolution, not a law, but that would include nuclear power for now. But around the time that
unless something
goes wrong. So around the time the rollout was happening, Ocasio-Cortez's office was also circulating a fact sheet with a little bit more extra context about the resolution. Now, that fact sheet contained some language that was that was anti-nuclear. It said we don't want to build new nuclear plants, which most people would, is kind of a more consensus position. But then it also contemplated closing down existing nuclear plants early. Now, this is a very problematic thing for people who study climate change, because nuclear power is, at the generation point, a zero-emission resource. It does not produce carbon, right? And it's 20% of our generation in the United States. It's a very big chunk of where our electricity comes from. So if you start to decommission these plants early, if you're not replacing them with 100% renewable electricity, which right now is probably not what's going to happen, well, then you're replacing it with electricity from coal and natural gas. So you're retiring a zero emission source and you're replacing it with at least some emitting sources. And that, when you only have, a decade or so to dramatically decarbonize the power sector, it's really problematic. So I think what we see in the Green New Deal is an internal debate within this left-of-center environmental movement over how should we prioritize. There are serious concerns about nuclear power, but maybe what we need to do is prioritize getting as many zero-emission resources on the grid as we can. And then, once these nuclear plants start coming offline, we can replace them with wind, solar, batteries, things like that. So it's been a debate, and I think it will continue to be a debate in the Green New Deal rollout.
It's an interesting confluence and potential conflict of two different currents, I would say. One is the sense that nuclear power represents major risk. It's a very risky technology. It's one of those classic low incidence, very high risk when you do your risk calculations, right? Low frequency, high risk in terms of something going wrong. Chernobyl was really, really bad, right? And obviously Chernobyl technology, you may know this better than I, was perhaps not as developed as some of the technology in some of the nuclear plants in North America. But then I've also seen studies showing that there's very old, very shaky technology in some North American plants as well. So, and it's been a long time since I've researched or written about it, but I did at one point. And I've seen Cherenkov radiation, too, produced by a nuclear reactor, and it was kind of cool, I hate to admit. But that was many years ago. But nuclear reactors, because of the low incidence, high risk problem, I mean, they are very clean unless something goes wrong.
And I think, the difference between nuclear reactors here and something like Chernobyl or even something like Fukushima is that, just frankly speaking, there are a lot of imperfections in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission rules and the regulations over nuclear plants, but certainly we look after our reactors a lot better than than the folks looking after Chernobyl did, right? And I think there are risks inherent with every sort of power generation, and certainly the climate risks are that are inherent in fossil fuels should be counted into that as well.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because you have in other words two poles on the risks management spectrum, right? Because you have low probability, high risk with nuclear of something quote unquote dirty or happening. With a low frequency, high risk. With coal, you have and carbon based fuel, you have extremely high frequency. It's being used. It is polluting with every usage, but to one extent or another. So, in other words, I would say the Green New Deal movement has got to come to terms with, even in the short term, how it feels about these two different ways of looking at climate risk.
Yeah.
Does it want to take a small but very real risk for a limited period of time, or does it want to continue to a higher level or even increase the level of pollution it's creating for certain in the short term, right? Is that a fair summary?
I think so, and I think, you know, a lot of people in the nuclear sector would really downplay the risks of nuclear reactors, and I think that is a fair thing to do. I mean, looking out over the long term, the rate of death from nuclear power is not very high. The incidents, like you said, it's a very intense event, but there aren't that many of them, and we do have good rules in the United States. I would say what I've seen over the past 2-3 years is the environmental movement kind of moving toward a more pro-nuclear direction. And there was actually a big report that came out at the end of last year from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they are a, you know, kind of the they are a landmark group. They've kind of looked after and scrutinized nuclear power for over 30 years, right? And they wrote a report called The Nuclear Dilemma, where they said, look, we are nuclear power watchdogs, and we have been for decades, but we recognize that the climate risk of closing down these reactors is intense. And that we need to make a prioritization, like you're talking about, in keeping zero emission power on the grid. And it's really interesting for me to see, even when I talk to the folks in the Sunrise Movement, the movement that's pushing AOC, pushing Markey, really pushing this movement all across the nation, it's almost as if they are reading, when I talk to them, reading exactly from the pages of this report, right? That was extremely influential in green circles to see UCS come out and say, hey, we need to actually consider keeping these plants online. And I think that, you know, I wouldn't say that the Green New Deal is pro-nuke, right? But I would say a lot of, and certainly there are people within that coalition who would like to see nuclear plants closed down sooner rather than later. But I think what we're seeing is kind of more of a coalescing around the position that the first thing we need to do is take care of the climate crisis. And, you know, if we're going to close something down, we should be closing down fossil fuel plants instead of just nuclear plants. And we should be making, as, you know, the Sunrise folks told me last week, if we're going to be making investments, let's make investments in zero carbon resources around our other zero carbon resources instead of replacing them. So that seems to be where the movement is going. And I think that will actually help it gain a lot more acceptance and credibility within the power sector and the policymakers who I report on every day, because people think that if you don't have a role for at least nuclear for a little while, maybe for even some carbon capture technologies, it's going to be very difficult once you get up to very high levels of renewables. You can get to maybe 75, 80%, but that last 20% might be prohibitively expensive, according to some modeling we see right now. So there's going to be a debate for years about whether it's going to be 100% renewables or renewables plus a little nuclear plus a little bit of CCS. That's not going to go away. But for now, I think we're coming to a point where we're going to say, let's keep the nukes we have at least for a little while longer.
The fascinating dimension of this question. So, Gavin Bade, is always great to talk to you, senior reporter for Utility Dive, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, RJ. Happy to be here.